The November wind cut through my coat as I stood on the front steps, my father's words still echoing in my ears. "Know your place, Samantha." The warmth of the Thanksgiving dinner I'd just been kicked out of felt like a lifetime away. None of them sitting around that polished mahogany table knew the truth that their family disappointment was worth $94 million. As I walked to my beat-up Honda, my phone buzzed with my financial advisor's contact. By morning, they'd discover exactly what happens when you dismiss the person who's been secretly keeping your world afloat. My name is Samantha Reed, and for 33 years, I've been the family disappointment. Growing up in Evanston, one of Chicago's most affluent suburbs, meant living under a microscope where every achievement was measured, weighed, and ranked against impossible standards. The Reed family wasn't just wealthy, we were Evanston royalty, the kind of family whose name appeared on hospital wings and charity galas, whose every move was documented in the society pages of Chicago Magazine. My father, William Reed, built his empire from the ground up, transforming a small construction business into Reed Holdings, one of the Midwest's most prominent real estate development firms. His sharp suits and commanding presence made him a natural for the cover of Forbes, and he wore success like a perfectly tailored armor. My mother, Charlotte Reed, was the former Miss Illinois who traded her crown for a different kind of throne queen of Chicago's social circuit. Her charity luncheons raised millions. Her dinner parties were legendary, and her perfectly styled blonde hair never moved, even in Chicago's notorious wind. Then there was my older brother Daniel, 35 and everything my parents had dreamed of in a firstborn son. Stanford MBA, executive vice president at Reed Holdings, married to a senator's daughter, father to 2 photogenic children who already showed signs of inheriting the family's golden touch. Daniel could walk into any room and own it within minutes, his laugh booming across country club dining rooms and boardroom meetings alike. My younger sister Melissa, 28, had taken a different path to success, but one equally celebrated by our parents. With her Instagram following of 2 million and her boutique fashion brand, Melissa Reed Collection, she'd built herself into a lifestyle influencer who graced the covers of Vogue and Harper's Bazaar. Her penthouse apartment in River North was featured in Architectural Digest, and her red carpet appearances were breathlessly covered by entertainment media. And then there was me. While Daniel learned to read financial statements, I was taking apart computers. While Melissa practiced her pageant walk, I was coding my first program. During family dinners that felt more like corporate presentations, where each of us was expected to report our latest achievements, I'd mumble something about my computer science projects while my parents exchanged those looks, the ones that said, "Where did we go wrong?" "Samantha's always been different," my mother would tell her friends. The word different delivered with the same tone one might use to describe a terminal illness. "She's very smart, of course, but she doesn't seem interested in the real world." The real world, according to the Reeds, consisted of boardrooms, galas, networking events, and strategic marriages. It was a world where success was measured in dollars, headlines, and social connections. Technology was something you hired other people to handle, not something you wasted your life pursuing. Our family gatherings were elaborate performances staged in our 8,000-square-foot Georgian mansion, complete with its marble foyer, crystal chandeliers, and oil paintings of long-dead relatives who'd apparently all been robber barons or railroad tycoons. Every holiday, every birthday, every random Sunday dinner became an opportunity for my parents to showcase their successful children and for me to be reminded of my shortcomings. "Daniel just closed the Harbor Point development," my father would announce over perfectly prepared dinner, his chest swelling with pride. 60 million in pre-sales before ground was even broken. "And Melissa's collaboration with that French designer is being featured in Paris Fashion Week," my mother would add, beaming at her youngest daughter. "The photographer said she has the most photogenic family in America." I'd sit there, picking at my food, waiting for the inevitable moment when attention would turn to me. "And what about you?" Samantha Aney updates on your computer hobby. Hobby. As if the years I'd spent studying, the sleepless nights coding, the patents I'd filed, The company I'd built from nothing were just elaborate ways to waste time until I came to my senses and joined the family business. The worst part wasn't the dismissal, it was the pity. I could see it in their eyes, especially during family photos that would later appear in Chicago Social Scene magazine. They'd arrange us carefully, Daniel and his perfect family on one side, Melissa looking like she'd stepped off a magazine cover on the other, and me awkwardly positioned somewhere in between, the family charity case who hadn't quite figured out how to be successful. Sweetheart, my mother said to me one evening after a particularly brutal dinner where I'd tried to explain my latest project. It's not too late to change course. Daniel could find you a position at the company, something entry-level where you could learn the business. Or you could go back to school, get an MBA. You're still young enough to start over. Start over, as if everything I'd accomplished was just practice, a false start that needed to be erased so I could begin my real life. That was the night I decided to prove them all wrong, not by arguing or defending myself, but by succeeding so completely, so undeniably, that they'd have no choice but to see me differently. I just never imagined it would take them this long to notice. Carnegie Mellon University became my escape hatch from the suffocating expectations of Evanston society. When I received the full-ride scholarship for their computer science program, my parents' reaction was telling pride mixed with confusion, as if I'd won an award for something they couldn't quite understand the value of. Carnegie Mellon is very prestigious, my mother told her bridge club friends. Though I'm not entirely sure what Samantha plans to do with a computer degree. Perhaps she'll work for one of those tech companies and meet a nice engineer. Even my academic success had to be filtered through their lens of marriage prospects and social climbing. Pittsburgh felt like breathing again. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who spoke my language literally and figuratively. My dorm mates stayed up until 3 a.m. debugging code, not planning charity galas. We competed over algorithms and data structures, not designer handbags and social media followers. I threw myself into my studies with the intensity of someone who'd been starving for intellectual stimulation. Machine learning, artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, every class opened new worlds of possibility. While my classmates were brilliant, I had something extra driving me the burning need to prove that everything my family had dismissed as a hobby was actually the future. During my junior year, I met Ethan Morales in Professor Davidson's Advanced AI seminar, where I was intense and driven. Ethan was laid back and intuitive, the kind of programmer who could see elegant solutions where others saw impossible problems. He was also the first person who never once asked me why I wasn't studying business or when I planned to get married. "You know what's missing in cybersecurity," Ethan said one evening as we worked on our final project, surrounded by empty coffee cups and crumpled papers in the computer lab. "Nobody's thinking about AI-powered threat detection for small and medium businesses. Everyone's focused on enterprise solutions, but there are millions of companies out there with sensitive data and no real protection." That conversation at 11:30 on a Tuesday night in November changed everything. We spent the next 6 months developing our concept, working out of Ethan's cramped apartment near campus. While our classmates were interviewing with Google and Microsoft, we were building something from scratch, an AI-driven cybersecurity platform that could adapt and learn from threats in real time, affordable enough for smaller companies but sophisticated enough to compete with enterprise-level solutions. My family's reaction to my decision to start a company instead of joining an established firm was predictably dismissive. "Entrepreneurship is very risky, sweetheart," my father said during one of our increasingly rare phone conversations. "Why don't you get some experience at a real company first? IBM has an excellent training program." "Or you could move back home," my mother suggested. "Your father could introduce you to some people. I'm sure there are technology positions at Reed Holdings." The idea of working for my father, of being the Reed daughter who needed family connections to succeed, made my skin crawl. I politely declined and stopped mentioning business details during our calls. Ethan and I moved to Chicago after graduation, pooling our resources to rent a tiny 2-bedroom apartment in Wicker Park that doubled as our office. The living room became our development center, filled with monitors, servers, and cables snaking across every surface. We lived on ramen noodles and determination, coding 18-hour days and sleeping on air mattresses. Our families couldn't have been more different in their reactions. Ethan's parents, both teachers from San Antonio, sent care packages and called every week to check on us. My parents didn't. "How's your little computer business going?" became my mother's standard greeting, delivered with the tone of someone asking about a child's lemonade stand. The first year was brutal. We burned through our savings, maxed out credit cards, and lived with the constant anxiety of impending failure. There were nights when I'd lie awake wondering if my parents were right, if I was just too stubborn to admit I'd made a mistake. But slowly, methodically, we built something extraordinary. Our breakthrough came during year 2 when we developed a machine learning algorithm that could predict and prevent zero-day attacks with 93% accuracy. It was elegant, revolutionary, and unlike anything else on the market. We filed patents, refined the technology, and started reaching out to potential clients. Our first customer was a small accounting firm in Oak Park that had been hacked twice in 6 months. Within 2 weeks of implementing our system, we'd prevented 3 separate intrusion attempts and identified vulnerabilities in their network they didn't even know existed. Word spread quickly in the tight-knit business community. Our client list grew from 1 to 10 to 50. We hired our first employees, moved into a real office, and started turning a profit. By year 3, we had 200 clients and a team of 15 brilliant engineers. Tech publications were writing about our revolutionary approach to democratizing cybersecurity. Venture capitalists were calling. And through it all, my family continued to see it as my computer hobby. The irony wasn't lost on me when TechCrunch featured us on their cover with the headline, "The AI Revolution Starts Here," while my mother was still asking when I planned to get a real job. The acquisition offer came on a Thursday morning in October, delivered by a team of executives from CyberCore Industries, one of the largest cybersecurity companies in the world. They'd been watching our growth, studying our technology, and concluded that buying us was cheaper than trying to compete with us. The number they offered made Ethan choke on his coffee. $94 million after taxes and splitting with Ethan and our early employees, more money than most people see in several lifetimes, more than enough to buy 10 Reed Holdings companies. I was 32 years old, and I was worth more than my entire family combined. The best part, none of them had any idea. The morning after the acquisition papers were signed, I made a decision that would have seemed insane to anyone else. I was going to keep living like I was broke. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to conduct an experiment. For 32 years, my family had made it clear that my worth as a person was directly tied to my financial success and social status. Now that I had more money than any of them could dream of, I wanted to see if they could love me for who I was, not what I had. So I kept my cramped one-bedroom apartment in Wicker Park with its creaky radiator and temperamental plumbing. I continued driving my 10-year-old Honda Civic with the dent in the passenger door and the radio that only worked on FM stations. When I showed up to family gatherings, I wore the same modest dresses from Target and department store clearance racks that had always earned me pitying looks from my mother. The irony was delicious. I could have bought a mansion in Lincoln Park, a penthouse downtown, or even a compound in the Hamptons. Instead, I chose to live modestly while sitting on a fortune that dwarfed my father's real estate empire. But I wasn't completely inactive with my wealth. I just made sure my family never knew about it. When my grandmother Reed was diagnosed with early-stage breast cancer, the family gathered for one of their dramatic crisis meetings in my parents' formal living room. The insurance would cover most of the treatment, but the best oncologist in Chicago, the one everyone agreed she needed, required a $50,000 upfront payment that didn't come with guarantees of reimbursement. "We'll figure it out," my father said, though I could see the stress lines deepening around his eyes. "The company's cash flow is a bit tight right now, but family comes first." 2 days later, an anonymous donation appeared in my grandmother's medical fund, covering not just the upfront payment, but enough for any additional treatments she might need. The donation came with a note, in memory of Thomas Reed. My grandfather, who had passed 5 years earlier. It must be from one of Dad's old business partners, Daniel speculated during Sunday dinner. He helped so many people over the years. I smiled and nodded, cutting into my pot roast while internally calculating how little $50,000 meant to my current net worth. When my cousin Jake, Aunt Patricia's son, was accepted to Northwestern but couldn't afford the tuition, another anonymous donation appeared. This time, it was a full 4-year scholarship supposedly from an educational foundation dedicated to supporting first-generation college students. Jake wasn't technically first-generation, but the paperwork was convincing enough. "What a blessing," my mother said, dabbing at her eyes with her monogrammed napkin. There are still good people in this world who believe in helping young people achieve their dreams. The scholarship fund was real. I'd established it through a shell corporation and hired a legitimate nonprofit organization to administer it. Jake would never know that his mysterious benefactor was his weird cousin who worked with computers. But the most satisfying intervention came when I discovered Daniel's secret financial troubles. Despite his executive position and his wife's trust fund, my golden brother had developed expensive tastes that outpaced even his considerable income. The Tesla, the boat, the private school tuition for his kids, the country club memberships, the ski house in Aspen, it all added up to a lifestyle that required creative financing. When his credit card bills hit 6 figures and he was facing the humiliation of having to ask Dad for a loan, an unexpected windfall appeared. A consulting contract for $25,000 from a tech company that needed traditional business expertise for market expansion. The work was minimal, reviewing some marketing materials and attending a few video calls, but the payment was real. Daniel never questioned why a technology company would pay premium rates for his insights, or why they seemed remarkably uninterested in his actual advice. He just cashed the checks and bought himself breathing room. The beautiful part was watching him brag about it at family dinners. "You know, these tech companies are finally realizing they need people who understand real business," he said, cutting into his steak with unnecessary force. "They're drowning in venture capital, but they don't know how to build sustainable enterprises. That's where people like me come in." I nearly choked on my wine, managing to turn it into a cough. "That's amazing, Daniel. Which company?" "Oh, it's called Quantum Innovations. Very cutting-edge stuff. You probably wouldn't have heard of them." Quantum Innovations existed solely on paper and in a bank account I controlled. Its only purpose was to funnel money to my brother while allowing him to maintain his superiority complex about traditional business versus technology. The pattern continued for months. Every time a family member faced a financial crisis, a mysterious solution would appear, never too obvious, never traceable back to me, but always perfectly timed to prevent real hardship. And through it all, my family continued to treat me like their disappointing charity case. Samantha," my mother said during Easter dinner, "your cousin Jake is doing so well at Northwestern. It just goes to show what young people can accomplish when they apply themselves to serious pursuits." "Maybe you should consider going back to school," my father added. "Get an MBA, learn some real business skills. It's never too late to change direction." I smiled and nodded, the way I always did, while mentally calculating that I'd just spent more on their various bailouts than most people earned in a decade. The test was working perfectly, and they were failing it spectacularly. But as the months passed, I began to realize something troubling. The more I helped them, the more entitled they became. The more I solved their problems, the more problems they seemed to create, and the more successful I became at secretly supporting them, the more they seemed to believe that their success was entirely their own. My anonymous generosity wasn't teaching them to value me, it was enabling them to continue dismissing me while living off my wealth. It was time to dig deeper and find out exactly what I was really supporting. The truth about my family's finances came to me the way most revelations do accidentally, and at 2:30 in the morning. I was reviewing the quarterly reports for my investment portfolio when I noticed something odd. One of my financial advisors had flagged several companies in the Chicago area that were experiencing irregular payment patterns and potential liquidity issues. Among them was Reed Holdings. My father's company, the cornerstone of our family's wealth and prestige, was on a watch list for businesses at risk of defaulting on their obligations. I stared at the screen for a full minute, convinced there had to be some mistake. Reed Holdings had been Chicago's golden child of real estate development for over 2 decades. Their projects were featured in architectural magazines, their groundbreaking ceremonies attended by mayors and celebrities. The idea that they could be struggling financially seemed impossible. But as I dug deeper into publicly available records, the picture became increasingly disturbing. Reed Holdings had been leveraging heavily for the past 3 years, taking on massive debt to fund increasingly ambitious projects. The Harbor Point development that Daniel had bragged about, the one with $60 million in pre-sales, had actually cost $85 million to build. The pre-sales had covered basic construction, but the luxury finishes, the environmental compliance issues, and the cost overruns had eaten into profits until there were none left. By 4:15 in the morning, I had compiled a financial profile that would have made any investor run screaming. Reed Holdings was surviving on a complex web of loans, credit lines, and what appeared to be increasingly desperate measures to maintain cash flow. But the real revelation came when I cross-referenced the family's personal expenses with the company's finances. My father had been using Reed Holdings as his personal ATM, drawing management fees and consulting payments that far exceeded industry standards. My mother's charity foundation, which threw lavish fundraising events that raised millions for various causes, was actually being subsidized by company funds disguised as corporate social responsibility investments. Daniel's consulting income, even before my fictional contributions, was being supplemented by Reed Holdings contracts that seemed to exist solely to justify his lifestyle. The company was paying his country club dues as client entertainment expenses and covering his family vacations as business development trips. But Melissa's situation was perhaps the most shocking. Her fashion brand, which she'd positioned as a scrappy startup success story, was hemorrhaging money at an alarming rate. The Instagram photos of her beautiful boutique didn't show the mounting inventory that wasn't selling, the celebrity endorsements that cost more than they generated in sales, or the fact that every month brought her closer to bankruptcy. Reed Holdings had quietly invested $2 million in Melissa Reed Collection as a diversification strategy. In reality, it was a desperate attempt to prevent my sister's very public business failure from destroying the family's reputation. The more I dug, the more horrifying it became. My family wasn't just struggling, they were living a complete lie, propped up by borrowed money and creative accounting that bordered on fraud. And then I found the most damning evidence of all. My father had been approaching family members and close friends with investment opportunities in Reed Holdings' upcoming projects. He'd convinced my Uncle Robert to invest $400,000 in a downtown hotel that existed only on paper. Aunt Patricia had mortgaged her house to invest $200,000 in a shopping center that had been quietly canceled months ago. These weren't investments, they were desperate attempts to raise cash by taking advantage of people who trusted the Reed family name. My father was running a Ponzi scheme using his own relatives as victims. The worst part was realizing how much my secret financial support had enabled this behavior. Every time I'd anonymously solved a family crisis, I'd given them breathing room to dig themselves deeper into debt. Every mysterious donation had allowed them to avoid facing the consequences of their reckless spending. My grandmother's medical bills hadn't been a temporary setback, they'd been the final straw that would have forced my father to admit his company was insolvent. My intervention had allowed him to continue the charade for several more months, during which time he'd convinced 2 more family members to invest their life savings. Daniel's credit card debt hadn't been a young professional learning to manage money. It was the symptom of someone addicted to a lifestyle he couldn't afford. My fake consulting payments had enabled him to rack up even more debt while believing his problems would somehow solve themselves. And Melissa's business wasn't a struggling startup that needed time to find its footing. It was a vanity project that was destroying her future while feeding her social media addiction. I sat in my humble apartment at 6:23 in the morning, surrounded by financial documents that painted a picture of a family I barely recognized. The Reeds weren't successful entrepreneurs navigating temporary challenges. We were con artists who had convinced ourselves that our lies were reality. The most bitter irony was that I had the resources to save them all. $94 million could have paid off every debt, funded every failing business, and provided the cash flow to turn Reed Holdings around. I could have been the family hero, the daughter who saved everyone from financial ruin. But they'd made it clear that they didn't want my help at least, not if it came with the acknowledgement that I was capable of providing it. They wanted to continue seeing me as the family failure while secretly living off my wealth. As the sun rose over Chicago, I made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. It was time to stop enabling their delusions. It was time to let them face the consequences of their choices. And it was time to find out what my family really thought of me when they couldn't afford to pretend otherwise. The Thanksgiving dinner was still 2 weeks away, but I already knew it was going to change everything. The Reed family Thanksgiving dinner was always a performance, but this year felt like opening night of a particularly elaborate Broadway production. I arrived at my parents' Evanston mansion at 5:30, deliberately parking my dented Honda between Daniel's new BMW and Melissa's white Tesla. The contrast was so stark it looked intentional, like I was making some kind of artistic statement about economic inequality. The house was decorated with the kind of understated elegance that screamed expensive taste: fresh orchids flown in from Hawaii, crystal stemware that caught the light from the chandelier, and enough candles to illuminate a small cathedral. Everything was perfect, just like it always was, just like it had to be to maintain the Reed family image. Samantha. My mother swept toward me in a designer dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. "You look nice," she said, her eyes taking in my simple black dress from Nordstrom Rack with barely concealed disappointment. The guest list read like a who's who of Chicago society: Mayor Richardson and his wife, the Aldersons from the country club, the Washingtons who owned half of downtown's commercial real estate, and various other members of the social elite who my parents collected like expensive art pieces. I made my way through the crowd, accepting air kisses and polite inquiries about my little computer business, while helping myself to champagne that probably cost more per bottle than I used to spend on groceries in a month. Sam. Daniel appeared at my elbow, looking every inch the successful executive in his perfectly tailored suit. "Good to see you. How's the tech world treating you?" "Can't complain," I said, taking a sip of champagne and studying his face. Up close, I could see the stress lines around his eyes, the way his smile didn't quite reach them. "How's the consulting business still working with those technology companies?" His chest puffed out slightly. "Actually, things are going incredibly well. Just landed another contract, even bigger than the last one. These tech entrepreneurs have no idea how to build sustainable businesses. They need people like me to show them the ropes." I nodded sympathetically, filing away the information that he was already spending money he hadn't earned yet from consulting contracts that didn't exist. Melissa materialized beside us in a dress that looked like it had walked off a Paris runway, her phone in hand as always, probably documenting every moment for her Instagram stories. "Oh my God, Sam, you have to see this," she said, practically vibrating with excitement. Vogue just featured my fall collection in their Emerging Designers to Watch article. "Look." She shoved her phone under my nose, showing me a small sidebar mention that mentioned her brand in passing among a dozen others. In Melissa's world, this counted as major press coverage. "That's wonderful," I said, meaning it more than she could know. "Business must be going really well." "It's crazy busy," she said, her smile faltering for just a moment. "Actually, maybe too busy. I'm having trouble keeping up with demand. Good problems to have." "Right." I nodded, though I knew from my research that her trouble keeping up with demand was actually trouble moving inventory that was sitting in warehouses, costing her money every day. At 7 o'clock sharp, my father called everyone to attention in the dining room. William Reed commanding a room was always something to behold even at 62. He had the presence of someone who had built an empire through sheer force of will. "Before we begin this wonderful meal," he said, his voice carrying easily across the table, "I want to take a moment to talk about what we're grateful for this year." This was the part I'd been dreading, the annual Reed Family Achievement Parade, where everyone's successes were highlighted and celebrated while I smiled and clapped from the sidelines. "I'm incredibly proud of my son Daniel," my father continued, raising his wine glass. "His leadership at Reed Holdings has been exceptional this year. The Harbor Point project has exceeded all expectations, and his expansion into consulting has opened new revenue streams for our family." Daniel beamed as the table applauded. I clapped along, wondering if anyone else noticed how carefully my father had phrased that exceeded all expectations rather than been profitable. "And Melissa," my mother chimed in, her voice warm with pride, "has built something truly remarkable with her fashion brand. Seeing her featured in Vogue, watching her influence grow, it's everything a mother could hope for." More applause. More careful phrasing, more reality carefully obscured behind glowing rhetoric. I waited for my turn, for the polite acknowledgement of my little computer business, or perhaps a gentle suggestion that I consider more traditional career paths. But the moment never came. My parents moved seamlessly from celebrating my siblings to thanking our guests for joining us. I'd been completely ignored. Again. As if I weren't even there. Mrs. Alderson, seated to my right, leaned over with a sympathetic smile. "And what about you? Dear, what are you up to these days?" Before I could answer, my Uncle Robert chimed in from across the table. "Samantha's still trying to figure herself out. Aren't you, sweetheart? It's never too late to change direction." "She's always been our dreamer," my mother said with a laugh that felt like a knife twist. "Very creative, but not terribly practical." "The family tells me you work with computers," said Mayor Richardson. "That's nice. My nephew does something similar, technical support for a bank. Steady work." "Technical support? They thought I did technical support?" "Actually," I said, my voice cutting through the polite murmur of conversation, "I sold my company last year to Cybercore Industries." The table went quiet. Daniel's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. That's wonderful, dear," my mother said carefully. "How much did you—" $94 million, I said clearly, "after taxes." The silence stretched so long I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Finally, my father cleared his throat. "Samantha, that's not really appropriate dinner conversation." "You want to know what's not appropriate?" I stood up, my napkin falling to the floor. "What's not appropriate is pretending I don't exist while you brag about achievements that don't actually exist." I pulled out my phone and opened the banking app that showed my investment portfolio. "This is my Charles Schwab account. This is my Goldman Sachs private banking statement. This is the acquisition contract with Cybercore Industries." I walked around the table, showing the screen to each guest in turn. "And this," I said, stopping in front of my father, "is the financial analysis I commissioned on Reed Holdings. Would you like me to share it with our guests? I think they might be particularly interested in the section about their outstanding investments." My father's face had gone completely white. "Get out," he said quietly. "I'm sorry." I said, "Get out of my house. Now." The dining room had transformed from elegant dinner party to crime scene, with everyone frozen in horrified fascination at the family drama unfolding before them. "William," Mayor Richardson said carefully, "perhaps we should—" "No." My father's voice was steel. "My daughter seems to think she can come into my home and humiliate me in front of my friends with her ridiculous lies." "Lies?" I turned back to face him, my phone still in my hand. "Would you like me to call Marcus Henderson at Cybercore right now? He's probably still awake on the West Coast. I can have him verify the acquisition details." "You're delusional," Daniel said, finally finding his voice. "Samantha, this is embarrassing, even for you." But Melissa was staring at my phone screen with wide eyes. She'd actually looked at the banking statements, and the numbers were too specific, too detailed to be fake. "The account balance," she whispered. Is $94.7 million as of market close today, I said, give or take whatever Tesla stock did in after-hours trading. Mrs. Washington, who'd been silent until now, leaned forward with renewed interest. Cybercore Industries. My husband sits on their board. They just made their largest acquisition ever, some AI cybersecurity firm founded by two young entrepreneurs from Chicago. The color drained from Daniel's face as he connected the dots. That's impossible, my mother said, but her voice lacked conviction. Samantha, if this were true, why wouldn't you have told us? Why would you keep living in that tiny apartment, driving that old car? Because I wanted to see if you could love me for who I am, not what I have, I said. Turns out that was a pretty naive experiment. This is ridiculous, my father said, but I could see him calculating, remembering conversations, trying to reconcile this new information with everything he thought he knew. You want proof? I opened another app on my phone. This is the Quantum Innovations account, you know, the consulting company that's been paying Daniel $25,000 for insights on traditional business practices. Daniel's fork clattered to his plate. Or how about the anonymous donation to Grandma Reed's medical fund, or the mysterious scholarship that covered Jake's Northwestern tuition, or the investment that's been propping up Melissa's fashion line for the past 18 months? The silence was deafening. I could hear my heart pounding, could feel the weight of 33 years of dismissal and condescension crystallizing into this single moment. That's right, I continued, my voice getting stronger. Your family disappointment has been secretly bankrolling your entire lifestyle while you've been treating me like a charity case. You're lying, Daniel said, but his voice cracked. I scrolled through my phone to another document. Here's the forensic accounting report on Reed Holdings. Should I read the executive summary out loud? The part about the leveraged debt, the phantom pre-sales, the family members who've been convinced to invest their life savings in projects that don't exist. My father lunged toward me, but Mayor Richardson caught his arm. William, calm down. She's trying to destroy everything I've built, my father shouted. You've already destroyed it, I said. I just documented the process. The guests were exchanging glances, some pulling out their phones, undoubtedly already composing texts to friends about the scene they were witnessing. By tomorrow morning, this would be all over Chicago's social circles. If any of this were true, my mother said desperately, why would you help us? Why would you support us financially and then ambush us like this? Because I'm an idiot, I said. Because I thought maybe, just maybe, if I gave you enough time and space, you'd eventually see me as more than your family's biggest failure. Instead, you used my money to dig yourselves deeper into debt while continuing to treat me like I was nothing. Uncle Robert was staring at me with dawning horror. The hotel investment. William, you said it was a sure thing. Robert, not now, my father hissed. How much? Aunt Patricia's voice was barely a whisper. The shopping center. How much of our money is gone? All of it, I said flatly. Every penny. There is no hotel. There is no shopping center. There's just Dad desperately trying to keep Reed Holdings from collapsing while taking money from family members who trust him. That's enough, my father roared. I don't know what sick game you're playing, Samantha, but it ends now. Get out of my house. Your house that's mortgaged to the hilt, I asked. The one with 3 liens against it that you haven't told Mom about. My mother's wine glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against her plate. William, she said quietly. What is she talking about? She's lying. Charlotte. She's always been jealous of what we've built, and now she's trying to tear it down with these fantasies. I looked around the table at the faces staring back at me, some shocked, some disgusted, some calculating the social implications of what they'd just witnessed. These were my parents' closest friends, their social circle, their entire world. I have one more thing to show you, I said, pulling up a final document. This is the cease and desist order I had my lawyers prepare. It legally prohibits Reed Holdings from soliciting any more investments from family members. It also requires full disclosure of the company's financial status to anyone who's already invested. You can't do that, Daniel said. I can, and I did. It was served to the company's registered address this morning. By Monday, every family member who's given Dad money will know exactly where that money went. My father's face had gone from white to red to purple. If you don't leave right now, I'm calling the police. And telling them that your daughter has more money than you do, that she's been supporting your family while you've been running a con game. I'm telling them you're trespassing. I looked around the table one last time, at the wreckage of relationships and the ruins of illusions. You're right. I don't belong here. I walked toward the door, then stopped and turned back. Oh, and Dad, you might want to check your business accounts on Monday morning. I have a feeling you're going to discover that your anonymous benefactor has decided to redirect her charitable giving. The last thing I heard as I left was my mother asking, in a voice barely above a whisper, William, is she telling the truth? I didn't wait to hear his answer. The November air hit my face like a slap as I walked to my Honda, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the keys. Behind me, I could hear raised voices through the mansion's windows, my father's angry denials mixing with my mother's increasingly frantic questions and the uncomfortable murmur of guests who had just witnessed the social event of the season. I sat in my car for a moment, letting the engine warm up while I stared at the house where I'd grown up. Every window glowed with warm light, and I could see silhouettes moving behind the curtains, my family's perfect world crumbling in real time while their guests bore witness to 33 years of carefully constructed lies finally coming apart. My phone buzzed. Daniel. What the hell is wrong with you? His text read, come back and fix this. Then Melissa. Sam, please, this is insane. Mom is crying. I turned off my phone and drove away. But I didn't go to my modest apartment in Wicker Park. Instead, I drove downtown to the Ritz-Carlton, pulled into the parking garage, and took the elevator to the 42nd floor to the penthouse I'd purchased 6 months ago and never told anyone about. The apartment was everything my family's house pretended to be genuinely luxurious, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of Lake Michigan and the Chicago skyline. The furniture was minimal but expensive, the kind of understated elegance that whispered rather than shouted about wealth. I poured myself a glass of wine from a bottle that cost more than my monthly rent used to be and sat on the Italian leather sofa, staring out at the city lights while my phone buzzed incessantly with calls and texts I wasn't ready to answer. At 11:15, I finally turned my phone back on and called Marcus Hendricks, my financial advisor. Samantha. His voice was alert despite the late hour. Is everything all right? Marcus, I need you to execute the Reed family financial separation plan we discussed. All of it. Tonight. There was a pause. Are you sure once we start this process, it's going to be very difficult to undo? I'm sure. All right. Give me 30 minutes to access the systems. I'll call you back when it's done. While I waited, I opened my laptop and began systematically dismantling 2 years of secret financial support. First, I canceled the automatic payments that had been covering Daniel's consulting fees from the fictional Quantum Innovations. The account would show insufficient funds by Monday morning when his next payment was due. Next, I dissolved the scholarship fund that had been paying Jake's Northwestern tuition. The university would receive notice that the spring semester payment would not be forthcoming, with a polite letter explaining that the foundation had reassessed its giving priorities. I terminated the investment account that had been propping up Melissa's fashion line. Her business checking account, which relied on monthly transfers from her silent partner, would be empty by the end of the week. The hardest decision was what to do about my grandmother's medical fund. After an internal debate that lasted 20 minutes, I decided to leave that account intact but transfer control to my grandmother directly. She was the only family member who had never treated me with contempt, and her cancer treatment was non-negotiable. Marcus called back at 11:57. It's done, he said. All automatic transfers have been canceled, all fictional consulting contracts have been terminated, and all shell corporations have been dissolved. The Reed Holdings emergency credit line that you've been quietly backing has been revoked. Is there anything else?" I looked out at the city, at the lights and windows where other families were probably having normal Thanksgiving conversations about football and leftover turkey. Not financial fraud and 30-year-old resentments. "Yes," I said. "I want you to prepare a complete financial disclosure package for every family member who has invested in Reed Holdings. Include everything: the real debt-to-asset ratio, the phantom projects, the leveraged loans. I want them to know exactly what they've gotten themselves into." "Samantha, that could have serious legal implications for your father." "That's his problem, not mine. And the family will know it came from you." "Good. Let them know exactly who they've been dismissing all these years." After I hung up, I sat in the silence of my secret penthouse, surrounded by the luxury I'd earned but never enjoyed, and felt something I hadn't expected: relief. For 2 years, I'd been carrying the weight of my family's financial problems on my shoulders while they continued to treat me like their biggest disappointment. I'd been enabling their dysfunction while hoping they'd eventually recognize my worth. But tonight had proved what I'd suspected all along: they didn't want to see me differently. They wanted to maintain their illusions about themselves, and my success threatened the narrative they'd built about who was valuable and who wasn't. My phone rang. Mom. I stared at the screen for a long moment, then declined the call. It rang again immediately. Dad. Declined. Then Daniel, Melissa, Uncle Robert, Aunt Patricia. I turned the phone off and walked to the window, pressing my palm against the cool glass. Somewhere out there, my family was dealing with the consequences of their choices for the first time in years. Tomorrow, they'd wake up to a world where their anonymous benefactor had vanished, where their safety net had been pulled away, and where the truth about their financial situation could no longer be hidden. For the first time in my adult life, I was completely free from their expectations, their dismissal, and their need for rescue. It felt terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. I opened a bottle of champagne, the good stuff, the kind I'd been saving for a special occasion, and toasted my reflection in the window. "Happy Thanksgiving, Samantha," I said to the woman staring back at me. "You finally learned to value yourself." Outside, Chicago glittered like a circuit board, all connected lights and flowing energy, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crisp November sunshine that made Chicago look deceptively cheerful. I woke up in my penthouse at 8:30, made coffee with beans that cost more per pound than I used to spend on groceries in a week, and settled into my favorite chair to watch my family's world implode. The first sign came at 9:15 when my phone started buzzing with notifications I'd chosen to ignore. By 9:45, the buzzing had become constant calls, texts, voicemails, and emails arriving in a digital avalanche of panic and rage. I turned off all notifications and opened my laptop instead, checking the news feeds that would inevitably cover what had happened at last night's dinner party. Chicago's social media was already buzzing with cryptic posts about shocking revelations and family drama at the Reed Thanksgiving gathering. At 10:20, Marcus called with the first update. The Reed Holdings payroll account was declined this morning, he reported with professional detachment. They tried to process Daniel's consulting payment and it bounced. The Melissa Reed Collection business account also showed insufficient funds when they attempted their monthly transfer. And the family investors? The disclosure packages were delivered by courier an hour ago. I imagine they're having some very interesting conversations right now. I could picture it perfectly. Uncle Robert sitting in his kitchen, reading through page after page of financial documents that proved his $400,000 had vanished into a black hole of debt and desperate accounting. Aunt Patricia discovering that her house was now mortgaged to fund a shopping center that existed only in my father's imagination. At 11 o'clock, I finally listened to my voicemails. My mother's voice was barely recognizable. "Samantha, please call me back. Your father. There are things I didn't know. Please, we need to talk." Daniel was more direct. "You destroyed our family over what petty jealousy. I hope you're happy." Melissa just cried through most of her message. I don't understand why you did this. I thought we were close. But the call that surprised me came at noon from my grandmother. Hello, dear. Her voice was steady and calm. I received a very interesting call from your Uncle Robert this morning. It seems there's been quite a lot going on that I wasn't aware of. Would you like to come have lunch with me? I think we should talk. I smiled for the first time since leaving the dinner party. My grandmother lived in a modest apartment in Lincoln Park, the kind of place that was comfortable without being ostentatious. When I arrived, she was setting out tea and sandwiches as if this were just another normal Friday afternoon visit. Sit down, sweetheart, she said, gesturing to the kitchen table where I'd eaten countless cookies as a child. I want to hear your side of the story. So I told her everything. The secret success, the anonymous donations, the years of financial support while being treated like the family failure, the discovery of my father's Ponzi scheme and my decision to finally stop enabling their dysfunction. She listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or raising an eyebrow, but never looking shocked or disapproving. You know, she said when I finished, your grandfather would have been very proud of you. For destroying the family. For having the courage to stop lying to yourself about who they really are. She reached across the table and took my hand. I've watched your father become someone I don't recognize, watched your mother prioritize appearances over integrity, watched your siblings believe they deserve success they haven't earned. I've been waiting for someone to hold them accountable. The medical fund, will continue to be deeply appreciated. But Samantha, that's not why I'm proud of you. I'm proud because you built something extraordinary and you didn't let their inability to see it diminish what you accomplished. That afternoon, my phone exploded with news alerts. Someone, probably one of last night's dinner guests, had leaked the story to Chicago's gossip blogs. Tech heiress exposed family's financial fraud at Thanksgiving dinner was trending on local social media. By evening, the financial media had picked up the story. Reed Holdings stock, which was privately held but tracked by industry publications, had essentially become worthless. 3 major construction projects had been canceled when investors pulled out. The company was expected to file for bankruptcy by Monday. My father's reputation, built over 30 years, had crumbled in less than 24 hours. At 7:30, I received one final call. My father's voice was barely recognizable hollow, defeated, aged years in a single day. Are you satisfied now? He asked. No, I said honestly. I'm not satisfied. I'm free. You've destroyed everything I worked for. I've revealed what you turned it into. There's a difference. He hung up without another word. I spent that evening on my balcony, 42 floors above the city, watching the lights come on as Chicago settled into weekend mode. Somewhere below, families were probably having normal conversations about normal problems: kids' soccer games, holiday shopping, what to watch on Netflix. My family was learning to live without their safety net for the first time in years, discovering what their lives actually looked like when stripped of illusions and anonymous financial support. It would be hard for them, probably devastating. They'd have to sell houses, liquidate assets, maybe even face legal consequences for the investment fraud. But for the first time in my adult life, their problems were truly their own to solve. I raised my wine glass to the Chicago skyline, to the city that had given me the space to become who I was always meant to be, and to the family that had finally learned exactly how much they'd underestimated me. Tomorrow, I'd start thinking about what to do with the rest of my life, with $94 million and a future that belonged entirely to me. Tonight, I was just going to enjoy the silence. Thank you so much for listening to this story of family, betrayal, and the ultimate revenge. I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're listening from and what you thought about Samantha's decision. Was she justified in cutting off her family's financial support, or did she go too far? Don't forget to subscribe to hear more stories like this one, and share your own thoughts about family dynamics and the price of success. Your engagement means everything to storytellers like me.